The candlelight quivered as if shivering from the cold, or from the unspoken things that roamed the Chambern palace that night. Behind the heavy wooden doors of the antechamber, the body of Archduke Franz Karl lay untouched, his skin pale with a bloom of smallpox, his lips frozen in silence. He had been dead for less than 20 hours, and yet the bell still rang for a wedding. Maria Josepha could not feel her own fingers, not from the temperature they had warmed her hands with fur and gloves and pressed herbal oils into her wrists. No, it was from the numbness of standing at the center of two opposing ceremonies. She could still hear the priest from earlier that morning, dust to dust, ash to ash, and now this one, in sickness and in health, until death do you part. Death had already parted them, but no one cared. The dress she wore had been altered hastily, white lace sewn over mourning black, like a disguise of purity over grief. Her lips, which should have been red with bridal joy, were pale, her eyes swollen. The veil fell over her like a shroud, and she wondered, was this a wedding or a second funeral? Outside, the snow fell without pause, a silent audience to the grotesque theater within the palace walls. Courtiers whispered. The archbishop avoided her gaze. Even the man who stood next to her, Charles, the younger brother of the dead groom, looked more like a shadow than a husband. He would not touch her hand. Not yet, not until the vows. She had loved Franz, not with fire or hunger, but with something steadier: trust, admiration, the rare feeling of being seen. When he fell ill just 3 nights before the ceremony, Maria stayed at his bedside, even as the sores bloomed and the fever stole his breath. When the coughing stopped, they took her away. She never saw him again. And now, they told her this: the alliance must remain. The Austrian Empire could not afford a broken engagement. The bridal chamber had been prepared. The guests had arrived. The crown demanded a wedding, not a scandal. She would marry his brother, in the same hall, with the same flowers, on the same altar. As the doors opened and the organ began to play, Maria took one breath. It did not reach her lungs, and she walked. How does a woman grieve when even her mourning is scheduled, scripted, and sealed with a kiss not meant for love? This is the story of a princess torn between duty and death, where the veil of marriage could not hide the stench of decay beneath. Stay with us to witness a wedding history tried to forget. In the glittering heart of the Habsburg Empire, Vienna stood like a gilded cage, majestic in appearance, suffocating in function. Behind the gold-leaf walls of Chambern Palace, every gesture was rehearsed, every tear accounted for, every marriage arranged, and no one understood this better than Archduchess Maria Josepha. Daughter of power, prisoner of protocol, she had been raised in corridors that smelled of incense and ink holy vows, and royal treaties bound into a single breath. From the moment she could stand without assistance, Maria was taught how to curtsy, how to bow her head just enough to show humility, but not submission. Her body was not her own. It was a symbol, a vessel, a diplomatic bridge waiting to be built. By 16, her future had been charted by men twice her age and 5 times her ambition. And when word came that she was to be wed to Archduke Franz Karl, heir to a crucial branch of the Austrian imperial line, she did not flinch. She had known it would come. What surprised her, however, was him. Franz Karl was not cruel. That, in itself, felt like a miracle. In a palace where affection was often traded for influence, he offered her something gentler, patience. He listened. He remembered the names of her ladies-in-waiting. He walked with her through the palace gardens, not to be seen, but simply to walk. It was not love, not in the romantic sense young girls whispered about, but it was something close and far more rare. Their engagement was announced with pomp, feasts, and sermons praising the divine will of dynastic union. But beneath the fanfare, a storm brewed, not in the skies, but in the blood. 3 weeks before the wedding, Franz Karl developed a rash on his back. The court physician whispered fatigue at first, Then came the fever, then the pustules, then the silence. By the time the truth reached Maria, it was too late for either medicine or mercy. Smallpox, the royal killer, the great equalizer of kings and commoners, had arrived. Maria asked to see him. She begged. The chamberlain refused. Infection protocols, he said. She sent a letter. No reply. In desperation, she slipped past the guards and found him herself shivering, swollen, gasping. He smiled when he saw her, or maybe grimaced. It was hard to tell. His face had already begun to swell. He died 2 days later, and the empire held its breath. This marriage was not just a union between two young nobles. It was a political necessity. The Habsburg crown had been balancing on a knife's edge for years. Fractured loyalties, rising tensions with Prussia, and an ever-fragile alliance with Saxony. The wedding was meant to bind the eastern provinces tighter. A delay would cause suspicion. A cancellation would invite rebellion. So the solution was simple, brutal, but simple. She would marry his younger brother, Charles. The guests were already in Vienna. The chapel had been decorated. The contracts were signed. Charles, shy and barely of age, would take his brother as place at the altar like a substitute candle lit before the first had gone out. Maria did not scream. She did not cry. She simply bowed her head and whispered, "When?" Her mother wept behind closed doors. Her father offered no comfort, only the cold reassurance that this was her duty. Her confessor tried to offer consolation, but his words rang hollow. God moves in mysterious ways, as if the Lord himself had orchestrated this macabre exchange. What no one saw, what no one wanted to see, was what died in Maria that day. Not just her betrothed, but something more intimate. Her voice, her will, her belief that she was more than a piece of paper passed between men with powdered wigs and polished swords. On the surface, preparations resumed. The tailor adjusted the dress. The musicians were paid again. The new groom rehearsed his lines. But within Maria, the silence grew. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that echoes long corridors of grief where no one dares walk beside you. She was now a bride to a boy who had stood behind his brother at every ceremony, now forced to step forward not for love, not even for desire, but for necessity. The court spun it as a noble gesture. How fortunate, they said, that the younger brother could honor his family and preserve the alliance. But Maria knew they were not celebrating her resilience. They were celebrating her replaceability. And so she stood in her chamber the night before the wedding, staring into a mirror she no longer recognized. The reflection wore pearls and lace, but the eyes had buried something, not just a man, but a future that would never be hers again. The organ played as if it hadn't known death had passed through the chapel only hours before. Every corner of the palace had been scrubbed clean, not of dust, but of memory. The corridor where Franz Karl's body had been carried was draped in new tapestries. The chamber where he died had been sealed and blessed. The choir was told to sing louder. If the walls remembered, they did not speak. Maria Josepha walked slowly toward the altar, her veil dragging behind her like a ghost too stubborn to let go. She did not cry, not because she was strong, but because the tears had dried the night before. When she sat alone in her bridal chamber and held the gloves Franz had worn just a week earlier, the faint scent of cedar still clung to them. She pressed them to her lips until dawn broke. Then she folded them away, along with her grief, and dressed. Charles stood at the altar with the stiffness of a boy wearing his brother's shoes. The cuffs were too long. The coat had been tailored for a broader chest. His face was pale, but not with mourning, with discomfort. He had never been meant for this, never meant for her. He did not look at Maria as she approached. She did not look at him either. They stood like statues being married by decree. The priest spoke the words as if they'd been spoken 1,000 times before, and they had, but never like this, never under the shadow of such indecency. There were moments brief, flickering where Maria thought she might collapse. When the ring slid onto her finger, she felt the cold metal bite her skin, like a shackle. When the kiss was announced, Charles hesitated. Then their lips touched dry, quick, formal. The court clapped. The empire had been preserved. The night. Vienna celebrated. Wine flowed. Musicians played. Diplomats smiled with satisfaction. But in the bridal chamber, silence reigned. The bed was large, lined with gold thread and rose petals, a mockery of romance. Charles sat at the edge, his hands trembling slightly. He was barely 17, she barely older. Neither of them spoke. What could be said? What words could bridge the chasm between obligation and agony? Maria undressed herself, slowly, deliberately. The chambermaids had left the room, leaving behind candles that flickered like hesitant witnesses. She stood in her shift, the same linen worn by countless Habsburg women before her. She felt ancient, used, hollowed out. Before anything had truly begun, Charles finally met her eyes. There was no lust in his gaze, only fear. He reached for her hand not to claim, but to ask permission. She gave it, not because she wanted him, but because she no longer wanted anything. What followed was not violent, but it was colder than cruelty. A ritual, a requirement, a sealing of treaties signed in blood, long before either of them were born. When it was over, Charles whispered a prayer. Maria stared at the ceiling, counting cracks in the plaster. She did not sleep. Over the weeks that followed, life resumed around her, or pretended to. She was now a wife, a duchess, a political tool successfully wielded. Her father praised her dignity. Her mother praised her resilience. The emperor himself sent a letter congratulating her on upholding the honor of the house. But no one asked her if she was breathing beneath all that praise. She walked the palace corridors like a figure in a painting, adorned, admired, and utterly untouchable. Franz's name was no longer spoken, his portraits removed, his memory boxed away like an old relic. And yet Maria saw him everywhere, in the shape of a door, in the curve of a violin's neck, in the taste of a cherry tart, his favorite, served now to her new husband. Charles, for his part, tried to be kind. He brought her books. He wrote her clumsy poems. He once attempted to take her hand in the garden, and she let him. But when he called her my love, she flinched. One morning, Maria began to bleed, not from illness, but from the womb. The court rejoiced. The archduchess was with child. A new era, a fresh start. She smiled for the paintings. She blessed the midwives. But when alone, she whispered to the space inside her, "Do you feel it, too? That your life has been written already, and there is no room for dreaming." Then came the fever. 6 months into the pregnancy, Maria collapsed. Smallpox again, they feared. The palace went into lockdown, isolation, cleansing. She survived barely. The child did not. Maria did not scream. She did not sob. When they brought her the cloth bundle and told her he never took breath, she simply asked, "Where is he now?" Buried. Quietly. No name, no ceremony. A child of silence, like his mother. After the illness, her skin bore faint scars along the hairline, behind the ear, places easily hidden with powder and pearls. But something deeper remained marred, something not visible to courtiers or painters. She no longer attended concerts. She no longer laughed. She rarely spoke more than required. The palace began to refer to her as the quiet one. But inside, Maria was not quiet. She was screaming into herself, into corridors where no one walked, into mirrors that no longer reflected anything she recognized. One evening, months later, she returned to the chapel where the wedding had taken place. No one saw her slip in. The candles had burned low. She walked to the altar and stood exactly where she had once said "I do." Then, slowly, she knelt and whispered, "Forgive me for surviving." The walls of Chambron did not echo. That was by design. The architects had built the palace to contain grandeur, not grief, to mute the sobs of women laboring in gilded beds, to swallow the screams of lovers exiled without warning, to absorb the gasps of those who saw too clearly what power truly demanded. Maria Josepha stopped speaking entirely the winter after her miscarriage. Not out of rebellion, but because language had become irrelevant. She had said everything once. "I'm afraid. I need time. I can't breathe. Please, not yet." And no one had listened. The palace didn't require her thoughts, only her presence. So she gave them that, a perfect image, silent and still. Her body remained fertile, or so the doctors claimed. "Time will fix this," they assured her, as if the loss of a child could be measured like a fever, and the cure was simply patience. The midwives prepared the nursery again. Charles visited her more frequently, trying to be tender in the only way he knew. Softly spoken questions, awkward attempts at intimacy, poetry scrawled in a boy's hand. But to Maria, everything he did smelled like lilies in a crypt, sweet, respectful, and entirely inappropriate for the rot that had already set in. She lay beside him at night without complaint. She let him touch her. She even touched back. But the warmth never reached her skin. The palace had taught her well. A wife is not required to feel, only to function. On the day of their first anniversary, the court arranged a celebration. Musicians were hired, tables lined with sugared fruit and sculpted marzipan. Charles gave a toast about devotion. Maria sat beside him, adorned in pearls. She smiled at the right moments. She raised her glass, but her mind was elsewhere. She was back in the antechamber where Franz Karl had lain. She remembered how the light had hit his face, how the sickness had rendered him unrecognizable, how she had kissed his brow anyway. That night, she returned to that room. It had been converted into a guest chamber. Fresh paint, new drapes, no trace of death. She stood in the center and pressed her hands to the floor. It was cold. She remained there 4 hours. No one came looking. That spring, Maria stopped leaving her quarters. She cited illness at first, headaches, nausea, fatigue. The doctors came. They found nothing, but the court allowed it. Perhaps they hoped rest would restore her womb. Perhaps they didn't care, as long as she didn't interfere. The only ones who noticed were the servants. One maid confessed, years later, that she had found Maria sitting on the floor of the dressing room, surrounded by open drawers, every garment laid bare, jewelry scattered like broken promises. She was holding a mirror, not to gaze at her reflection, but to watch the tears fall from her chin into the glass, drop by drop. And then came the painting, a portrait commissioned by the emperor, of Maria and Charles seated in unity, symbols of dynastic strength. The artist, a rising talent from Florence, requested several sittings. Charles complied readily. Maria sat once, and then refused. The final painting was stunning. Charles, proud and youthful, one hand resting on Maria's shoulder. Maria, in soft pastels, gaze turned slightly away from the viewer. The painter explained it was to capture her mystery, her delicate composure. But it wasn't mystery. It was absence. She was already vanishing. Word began to spread. The Duchess is melancholic. The Duchess is fragile. The Duchess is barren. The truth was simpler. The Duchess was gone, and no one noticed. The turning point came in the form of a letter. It arrived on crisp parchment, bearing the seal of a cousin in Saxony, a woman she had grown up with. In it, news. Another cousin had died in childbirth, the 5th that year. The final line read, "At least she is no longer afraid." Maria folded the letter slowly. Then she walked to her vanity, opened a drawer, and took out a ribbon, the one Franz Karl had once tied around a book of poems he had gifted her. She held it for a long time, then placed it beneath her pillow. She did not sleep that night, or the next, or the one after. What she did instead was drift between rooms, between hours, between fragments of memory. Sometimes she would sit in the chapel for entire afternoons, not praying, but listening to silence, to echoes, to the creak of wood contracting in the heat. Other times, she stood before the nursery door. It had been locked since the miscarriage. No one dared open it. She would rest her hand on the doorknob, then walk away. Then came the feast of Saint Joseph. Charles begged her to attend Mass. The court was watching. They needed reassurance. He wept, briefly, at her door. She heard him, but she did not open it. Instead, she looked into the mirror again, not at her face, but at the ribbon, still under the pillow, still waiting. And in that moment, she realized something so devastatingly simple that it stole the breath from her lungs. Nothing would change, not if she mourned, not if she smiled, not if she prayed, not if she bore a son, not if she died. The palace would go on, the empire would endure, and she would be replaced, as wives before her had been, as mothers and daughters had always been, folded neatly into the tapestry of power like embroidered initials on a veil. Her voice, her sorrow, her rage, none of it mattered, not here, not in Chambern, not in Vienna, not in history. History, when told by palaces, rarely remembers women like Maria Josepha, not because they were unimportant, but because their pain was ordinary, their obedience to complete. They did not rule. They did not revolt. They were not martyred in public squares or immortalized in revolutions. They simply endured and enduring, or forgotten. Maria's story is not a tragedy because she was silenced. It is a tragedy because her silence was expected. In the world of 18th century European monarchy, the female body was not a person, it was a document, a seal, a conduit. To be born a princess was to be born a political instrument, polished and preserved like fine china, and just as breakable. The Habsburg court, one of the most powerful dynastic webs in European history, did not function on love. It functioned on contracts, between thrones, between bloodlines, between bodies. And Maria's wedding, even in its horror, was not an aberration. It was standard procedure. A fiancé dies. The bride still marries. The treaty must hold. From the outside, it seems grotesque. Marrying a woman to the brother of her dead betrothed, within hours of his funeral. But from within the palace walls, it was simply efficient. The empire could not afford pause. Sentiment was a luxury of poets and peasants. For royalty, function must override feeling. What the story of Maria Josepha exposes is not just personal sorrow, but the brutal machinery of dynastic survival. Her womb mattered more than her grief, her appearance more than her voice, her silence more than her survival. She was a perfect daughter of empire, and that is precisely what destroyed her. Modern viewers often ask, why didn't she rebel? Why not flee or refuse? But that is to impose modern choices on a world that did not permit them. In her world, rebellion was not a door, it was a wall. Marriage was not a decision, it was a sentence. And grief was not something to express, it was something to conceal. Because for women of blood, history was not a story you told. It was a cage you inherited. And what is perhaps most haunting is how easily that system erased its victims. Maria Josepha's name appears in footnotes. Her portrait hangs in back corridors. The historians mention her lineage, her fertility, the alliances she helped secure, but rarely her silence, rarely the chapel, rarely the fact that she stood at the altar while the body of the man she loved cooled just a room away. We are left only with fragments, and yet, within those fragments, a deeper truth emerges. That history is not made solely by kings and generals, but by bodies offered up for peace, by women traded like currency, by the quiet suffering that made empires look stable from the outside. Maria's life is a mirror. It reflects the contradictions of monarchy, where pageantry conceals pain, where loyalty costs your soul, and where the most obedient suffer the cruelest fate not because they failed, but because they succeeded in being exactly what the crown required. Her wedding, so grotesquely timed, so profoundly unnatural, is not just a bizarre footnote. It is a metaphor for monarchy itself, a system that demands appearances be upheld even if the corpse is still warm, a system that turns grief into protocol, a system where to be useful is to be disposable. And while Maria Josepha may have vanished into the drapery of time, her story whispers beneath every gilded frame, every royal portrait, every carefully posed smile from queens and princesses across centuries. She reminds us that behind every union forged in gold, there may be a woman quietly breaking beneath it. Not all ghosts wear chains. Some wear wedding veils. She walked down the aisle with a corpse behind her. The walls did not breathe. The chandeliers did not flicker. The palace, in all its grandeur, stood still, too afraid to acknowledge what it had done. It had taken a girl in mourning and dressed her in white. It had moved the coffin aside to make space for a kiss. Maria Josepha did not tremble, not because she was strong, but because she had already begun to vanish. In the silence between organ notes, in the pause before vows, in the air that had not yet cleared the scent of death, she dissolved. Not all at once, but piece by piece. With each step toward the altar, she left something behind, a memory, a feeling, a name. By the time the ring touched her finger, there was nothing left but a face and a function. The court called it resilience. The emperor called it duty. The church called it divine providence. But it was none of those things. It was disappearance disguised as obedience. They buried Franz Karl quickly, quietly. No fanfare, no bells. His name erased from the narrative almost as fast as it left Maria's lips. She never spoke it again. Not in public, not in private, not even in prayer. The veil she wore the day was folded and stored in the archives. It still exists. If you found it, you might think it beautiful. But beauty lies. It hides the truth of what it covered. Not a bride, but a wound. Not a beginning, but an ending. A girl forced to smile while her body was bartered. A silence so vast it echoed louder than any wedding hymn. She lived for years afterward, quiet years, obedient years. She smiled when needed, sat for portraits, attended functions, tried again to bear children. But nothing ever took root. Not in her womb, not in her spirit. She did not die dramatically. No poison, no scandal. No final speech. She simply stopped. One morning, she did not rise. They said it was a fever. But those who had known her closely, if anyone truly had, knew better. She had been dying since the wedding. Only the burial was delayed. And now, centuries later, she lingers, not in textbooks, not in monuments, but in a question no historian dares ask. What is left of a woman when the world only wants her silence?